the cachet of Switzerland still exists, for
It's
sure.
an expectation of quality.
Correct.
When you see Swiss made.
Someone gives you a box of chocolates from Switzerland, you know they're going to be good.
That is true.
You know what I mean? You're never going to get in trouble coming home with Swiss chocolates or a Swiss watch.
Correct.
You just have an expectation that the Swiss are going to do it right.
Today we're going to talk about, Swiss made or not Swiss made. Is the label worth everything, or are brands outside of the bubble, worth considering, and everything in between? I think it's so important because 90% of the watches, are Swiss made. Maybe not by volume or whatever, but most of the watches you think about immediately are Swiss made. But there are so many brands that come out of the Switzerland bubble that are really good quality brands.
Well, obviously Swiss made is what we think about, especially in high-end luxury watches, which is what we deal in. The major brands, it's Rolex, it's Patek and Audemars, kind of all from the same area. And maybe 25, 30 years ago, we started seeing some breaks. And I think the biggest break started with Lange, because it was kind of, to me, the first, it was a small brand, so it wasn't a big brand at the time, but it was like the first breakaway, and they came out with some groundbreaking pieces.
That's the important part, right? They came
Very
heavy.
important, because they didn't just try to be what Switzerland was. They kind of went their own direction. And by design and by finish and quality, they tried to raise the bar on Switzerland to the point where it got some attention. And some of the big heavyweights, we spoke to Philippe Dufour, who still talks about Lange and their quality.
Yeah, that was one of the first brands that popped into his mind.
Yeah, that and some of the Japanese brands. So I think it was fascinating that, and again, I'm a Lange junkie. Their designs to me are just very specific to them. Across the room it's a Lange. You flip it over and you understand what they were trying to accomplish. It's different than Switzerland, but it has a real reason to live. And one of the things I love about a lot of these brands we'll talk about is they are distinctive, they're unique. Lange certainly fits that. To me, my favorite part of them is the finish. If you flip it over, you can see hand engraving, you can see, the hand of the master who made it is indicative in it, and there's some personality to it, some true heart to it, which I love. And again, it's an area of Germany where watchmaking was there 150 years ago. It went away, obviously, after the war, as everything did, and now has come back to the point where it's, home to probably a dozen brands now. I love brands with DNA that stick to their DNA. They didn't try to mimic everything else that was out there. They went in a different direction.
And it helped pave the path for other brands that were outside of Switzerland to make a mark. Correct. So once the consumer saw, hey, there's great watchmaking prowess in other parts of the world, it's worth taking a look at. You saw other brands start popping up and producing great pieces. And I think one of the things that you said earlier was that the bar had been set by the Swiss, which forced a lot of the others, let's take Grand Seiko, which we have on the table, let's take Lange Söhne, to even operate at a higher level to differentiate themselves so that there would be that much of a difference. Because if they were doing the same level or worse,
people would pick Switzerland.
Consumers would say, you know what, stick with Swiss made, it's better. But they went above and beyond so that it was hard not to see the level of detail and perfection.
That's a great point. Grand Seiko is an interesting one to pick up because it's a great brand that they have Seiko, right? Quartz crisis is going on, they're doing great. The bank is doing well. There is no reason to create the Grand Seiko line. There is no reason to work so hard on the finishing that they do, and even though up to the Credo line, and invest all the money into the research and development when they could easily just made quartz watches, go straight to the bank, and not have a problem. And like you said, there's a reason to live for them, right? They wanted to be more than just a quartz watch. They wanted to show that they appreciated watchmaking, they appreciated horology, and wanted to show what they could bring into the table. And it's a great example of a reason to live. I love that. That's going to be my new thing.
There you go. Well, the other thing I love about them is they took the finish aspect of it. Everything from the case to the dials specifically is taken to the next level in finish. And that's one of the things that, like, if you go back to early Swiss watchmaking, it was all about the finishing of the movements, the finishing of the dials, the pocket watches. It was, everything was, had the highest quality of finishing. And it wasn't mass produced, it was individuals. And I think these smaller brands that came later realized that that was the right way to go at it, because maybe Switzerland had rested on their laurels a little bit, whereas it's like, oh, it's Swiss made, you know it's the best quality, we don't have to go that extra mile on every single movement. Whereas even like Lange, in their cheapest movement, had hand engraved balance cocks, they had hand finishing, everything that was done, even on the inexpensive models. And Grand Seiko's the same way. Every single model's finished at a level that, honestly, there's nothing else in that price point that's done.
Well, I think too, when you look at the different brands, the efficiency of a Lange, how it's constructed, almost from a, if you're looking at it like it's a car engine, is pervasive of German industries in general. And then you look at Japanese products and trying to achieve perfection in terms of the finishing of whatever type of product that it is. And as you had mentioned about the dial or the hands, they do faceting on the hands, longer than typical graining on the hands.
Right.
Zaratsu finishing on the case and bracelets, which is the similar technique that was used on samurai swords. So you see that carrying through, not just on Grand Seiko, but other smaller batch Japanese watchmakers. And I think if you look at other German brands, like Nomos, they obviously far less price point.
Correct.
Not as high a level of finishing, but again, a focus on precision, efficiency.
Right, simplicity in design.
Simplicity in design. So based on the place that you're going to, you see the cultural values carry over into the brands themselves.
And that's one of the things I love, because yes, Swiss and even different parts of Switzerland, you'll get different feels of watches. You'll get a little more of the engraving towards the French side and a little more artistry as opposed to some of the technical areas. But I love that about the Japanese, that attention to detail that you always expect and know the pride is in it. And the Grand Seiko has been around for a while, but never came outside of Japan. I mean, they never tried to sell it globally.
Exactly.
It was just for their own.
right. Their own market loved the product.
But
Correct.
the quality's so good. People hunted for them, you know. Just like when Tudor for a while wasn't allowed in the U.S. and like some, you know,
Some people would bring them back and you'd be like, what the heck is that?
Your friend who was an international traveler would go and come back and you'd have something cool and you'd like, oh, what's this? It's a Grand Seiko, it's a Tudor. And a reason to live, I just keep coming back to that because they keep pushing forward. I think we should step one quick step back and kind of the reason why Swiss made is so important, we have to realize that historically, watchmaking was kind of a broad global thing. You know, the British kind of started it, and we can kind of go back and dice that up. The British started it, came over to the Americas, and then it spread throughout Europe and France, and everybody made great things. And then we had the World Wars, and World War II especially, because so many countries were involved, and the countries, you know, had to, you know, if you made a very tiny mechanical parts, I mean, you can make gun parts and you can make all these things you could deem a medical instrument. So, you know, the government came to you and said, hey, Mike, you gotta shut down your shop.
We're changing it over, right?
You know, and because Switzerland was in the unique position of being neutral, all of their manufacturers were able to keep producing and keep spreading, and they were the only ones to really be selling watches because people were still buying at that time. And that's why, you know, Swiss made is so big now. But would you, if a watch is presented to you,
Right.
does the word Swiss or Swiss made, is that the first thing that comes to your head?
I think it does to some extent. I mean,
Okay.
you really still think of that. And I think that's credit to Rolex and to Patek, who've just done such a great job for such a long period of time, that everybody associates those brands with super high quality, and that carries over to the rest of the Swiss industry.
Correct.
And even when they've done lower end things, I mean, Swatch, you know, brought back the Swiss industry and at a whole different level. But the thing that I always am surprised with in this world, with so much money that would go into this business, is why nobody's done it in the U.S. And nobody's, you know, I mean, wouldn't somebody you would think try it in the U.S. even at a small level, but somebody would come up.
That's a very interesting question because I always think about that too. You take a brand like Bremont, right? Bremont is made in the UK. They started out slowly. And slowly grew. Now they build their own factory. They're slowly moving towards in-house. Never said, hey, we're in-house movements or anything. They just wanted to make quality watches. The whole thing was really good limited editions and hardened cases. I never understood why somebody in the U.S., of course, there's smaller guys, there's RGM, and there's a lot of other small groups. Yeah, exactly. But I never understood why, you know, a group of guys together didn't invest in one great watchmaker and have a nice American-made brand, because the heritage is there, the quality of
The heritage of pocket watches. I mean, America was, known for pocket watches.
But I think nowadays, the fact of the matter is that most watches are not entirely made by one company. So whether it's the dial, the hands, the mainsprings. So if you're a company
Supply
that's
chain,
just
right.
starting out, most of your supply chain, the fact of the matter is going to come from Switzerland.
Right.
So whether it's the dials, the hands, the cases, whatever
Much
it may
easier to
be.
do it that way.
And it tends to be, again, much easier to do it that way from a cost perspective. And then it also comes down to the expectation of quality. You know, even as we talked about going back to World War II, soldiers that were going over and they would pass through Switzerland, they would buy a watch.
Right.
They didn't have anything else to spend the money on while they were over there. And they, you know, Swiss watches had that connotation of quality and longevity, and they would buy a watch. And I just think that culturally, that's been passed down. No different than purchasing a German automobile. Like how often, you know, you don't have sports cars being made in Portugal. You know, somebody there theoretically could
do it.
In the comments, somebody would be like,
you know, could do it, but you know, it's just Porsche has a pretty good thing going on right now. So, you know, but I think as far as a watch company goes, you are starting to see more companies form in other parts of the world because, you know, you can source a lot of the components, and the story now is what the customer's buying. And we'll take Ressence, which I think is a good example.
Love that.
The founder of the brand didn't come from a watchmaking background. He came more from a design background, and he wanted to utilize movements that could be easily fixed, where the components were available, but he had an ingenious way of displaying the time. And he wanted to, for him, it was recreating the telling of time. That was going to be his story. And that, I believe, is what resonated with customers because it was different than what everybody else was producing. And it was because he, A, came from a different place and didn't necessarily come from a watchmaking background. Had he come from a traditional
preconceived notion.
watchmaking school, he may have been trying to execute something along the veins of some of the other brands that we have on the table, but he had a fresh perspective and a fresh take, which is what I believe allowed the brand to be successful.
I mean, I've spent some time with Benoit. He's an amazing guy, but he's super passionate about his brand. And I mean, that's to me is the best part. And he will talk to you about it and explain it to you and give you that whole perspective on it.
And you're buying a watch now that they may only be making 300-400 watches a year.
Right.
So this isn't 100,000, 60,000, 4,000. This is, you're buying into a small batch production. So like when they're
A man's vision.
Yeah. So
Which is
when
what I
they're
love,
when
yeah.
they're ordering dials and they're going and they're picking stuff out, like, you know, we're not buying 5,000 of that. We're buying, hey, I need 20 of the green dial, and you know that like there's only going to be 20.
Right.
So I mean, it's cool.
That's a great point. You know, a big reason why there is an American brand is because, you know, there aren't enough collectors who say, hey, I will support you. And I will buy this watch. I believe in your dream. Build this watch. It might take a little bit of time. But again, when you're a smaller company and you're just buying $10 versus 2,000, the price of that, each of those $10 are way more than one of those $10,000. And a great circle back is to the Mosers. And we have this beautiful Vanta Block Venture Tourbillon, which is like,
Sick.
words cannot describe how beautiful this watch is. But none of Moser pieces put Swiss made on their dial. And they had a big thing because I think the Swiss industry right now is about 60% or so you need.
Right.
While Moser makes, you know, about 99% of their watch all in Switzerland. They felt really prideful of that. So I think a good thing to know is, you know, what goes into the watch, what goes into making the watch. And I do think that, you know, brands outside of Switzerland do have to fight a little bit more to get noticed, but that just means the cream rises to the top, right?
Mm-hmm. No, definitely.
And it gives everybody more choice. I mean, some of the things that have been done outside of Switzerland in the last 20, 25 years, I think really helped raise the bar for everybody and put pressure on the Swiss to up their own game.